Vrox, the commander of the Shelter Dominion, stood silently in the observation chamber of his fleet's flagship, his eyes glued to the holographic display in front of him. The humans were a strange and unpredictable species, their history full of conflict, and yet their resolve was undeniable. The Shelter had watched them for years in their attempts to study their weaknesses, but there was something about this moment that caught Vrox's attention, something different. A signal from a human vessel was being transmitted. A human child was at the helm of a starship simulator. The child was no older than 8 or 9. Vrox raised an eyebrow. His species did not understand the concept of childhood in their own culture. Children were trained from birth to be warriors or scientists to contribute to the Empire's advancement. This human seemed far too young to be operating such complex technology, but there was something captivating about the way the child interacted with the simulation. The starship was massive, its holographic controls shimmering around the small human who sat in the center of a glowing cockpit. The ship itself appeared to be a training model built for human crews. But what intrigued Vrox was how the child handled it. The small hands moved effortlessly across the controls with a fluidity that spoke of experience far beyond the child's years. The simulation that Alex was navigating was no simple game. Vrox could see the virtual world surrounding the child was filled with obstacles, real dangers, the kind that would make any experienced starship commander pause. Vrox was no stranger to the power of simulations. His own species had developed them for years, but nothing prepared him for what he saw next. The simulation threw a series of obstacles at the child, an asteroid belt with twisting pathways. To navigate, hostile alien ships emerged out of nowhere and began attacking the starship. Vrox expected panic, but there was none. Instead, the child responded with a calm that was almost eerie. The small hands on the controls never faltered even as enemy fire blasted across the shields of the starship. Alex's focus was unshakable. The child moved the ship with precision, dodging laser blasts and weaving through asteroids in ways that defied the expectations of the simulation. Vrox watched as the child's face remained calm. Not even a flicker of worry or hesitation crossed the small features of the human's face. The commander leaned forward. He had seen simulations before, but never anything like this. Something felt different. As the simulation escalated, Alex's actions grew bolder. The child pushed the starship to the very edge of what should have been possible. The ship sped through the asteroid field, and in a stunning maneuver, Alex pulled the ship into a perfect barrel roll to dodge an incoming blast from an alien fighter. The agility was incredible. Vrox's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary child. This was something more, perhaps a fluke. But still, this kind of skill was beyond anything his species had ever anticipated from such a young human. The commander felt his curiosity rise. His initial dismissal of the child as a mere player in a simple game had been wrong. This wasn't a game at all. This was something more. Vrox commanded his fleet to scan the signal more closely. There was more to this child, and he would find out exactly what that was. Vrox leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the human child's every move. The simulation had now intensified. A series of hostile alien ships emerged from the edge of the virtual space and surrounded the human starship. With no way out, the enemy ships were designed to overpower any vessel that encountered them, yet the child's hands remained steady on the controls. The starship's shields flickered under the barrage of incoming fire. But Alex didn't hesitate. The child's eyes were locked on the display, unblinking as the enemy ship circled in for the kill. Vrox couldn't help but be intrigued. There was a rhythm to the way the child moved the ship, a series of movements that didn't seem to follow the logic of conventional space combat. The enemy ships launched a coordinated attack, sending waves of laser blasts toward the human ship. Alex swerved and dodged the attacks with an almost instinctual grace. The commander's eyes widened as the child didn't simply evade the shots, but rather used the enemy's own fire to gain an advantage. Each evasive move brought the starship closer to the asteroids that filled the simulation's environment, yet Alex never collided with a single one. The child's movements were precise, as if the simulator had been designed to fail, and yet the child was rewriting the rules every time the situation seemed hopeless. Alex pulled off a stunning maneuver, sending the ship spiraling into a tight loop that deflected the incoming fire and launched the starship toward an enemy ship with a collision course. Vrox's mouth went dry. The child wasn't just reacting to the simulation. The child was outsmarting it, anticipating every move before it happened, a tactic that the shelter would only consider after years of rigorous training. The commander couldn't look away. He had studied human strategy before, but what he saw now was beyond anything he had expected. This child had an ability to think in ways that defied conventional tactics. The shelter had mastered warfare through precision and calculated strategy, but this human seemed to rely on something more primal, something that felt like pure instinct. Vrox had encountered countless species in his long career. Some had mastered technology, some had brute strength, but none had approached combat in this way. The child was creating possibilities that shouldn't even exist within the limits of the simulation. The more Vrox watched, the more the simulation seemed to bend and warp around Alex's decisions. The child would improvise, using asteroids as shields or outmaneuvering enemies in ways that should have been impossible. And just when Vrox thought it couldn't get any more impressive, the child made a move that left him speechless. With one final move, Alex turned the ship toward the largest enemy vessel and executed a risky high-speed attack, weaving through the alien ships while sending a barrage of counterfire in every direction. The move was so unexpected, so bold, that the simulation crashed entirely. For a split second, Vrox thought he had seen a malfunction in the system, but no, the child had done something so complex, so unpredictable, that the simulation had failed to keep up with the action. The child had broken the system itself. The screen flickered back to normal, but Vrox was still staring in disbelief. This human child had not only survived the impossible, but had found a way to break the game itself. The commander felt a chill run down his spine. Something about this was wrong, and yet deeply fascinating. There was a wild brilliance in what Alex had done, the kind of brilliance that could change the course of everything. Vrox didn't know it yet, but he was witnessing the beginning of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. Vrox couldn't pull his eyes away from the screen, even as the simulation reset to a new sequence. The child, Alex, now surrounded by a swarm of alien warships. The commander's mind raced. How could this child have so thoroughly outmaneuvered the simulation? How had Alex managed to force the system to crash, to rewrite the very rules of the game? There was something about the human's behavior, something more than just a simple display of technical skill, something instinctive. It was as if the child had tapped into a deeper, almost primal understanding of strategy that went beyond the mechanics of the simulation. Vrox gave an order to his officers: run a full analysis. I want to know everything about this human child. His subordinates scrambled to pull every piece of data they could find. As the screen in front of Vrox flickered, showing Alex's flawless control of the Starship simulator, the information began to flood in. Earth, the primitive planet that Vrox had underestimated for so long, had been running an ambitious training program, one specifically designed to develop young minds into master tacticians. The program, though not widely known, had been in place for several decades, slowly producing some of the brightest strategic minds the human race had to offer. The reports revealed something even more staggering. Alex wasn't just an ordinary child. The human had been groomed from birth to become one of Earth's elite military strategists. The child's development had been painstakingly structured, with intense cognitive exercises and exposure to simulated warfare from an early age. Alex was part of a new breed of human, trained not just to react, but to innovate, to adapt, and to outthink anything thrown at them. Vrox sat back in his chair, his mind churning. These humans weren't merely reactive. They were creative in ways that his species could not fathom. He knew the shelter were efficient, their strategies perfect in their execution, but they were predictable, rigid in their thinking. The humans, on the other hand, were capable of bending reality itself. How could a species so young, so seemingly primitive, possess this kind of adaptability? The data continued to pour in, and Vrox's understanding deepened. The training programs used a combination of virtual warfare, psychological conditioning, and even real-time strategic feedback to develop human children like Alex into unparalleled problem solvers. These children were not merely trained to use existing strategies, but to invent entirely new ones. They weren't bound by the limitations of tradition, and that made them dangerous. Dangerous in a way the Shelter had never considered. As Vrox's mind raced, his officers reported more findings. Alex had excelled in nearly every aspect of the training. Tactical analysis, leadership, and, most importantly, the ability to adapt to unpredictable scenarios. The child's mind was constantly evolving, constantly learning and improving, as if the very act of facing challenges drove Alex to a new level of understanding. Vrox felt a growing unease. These children weren't just talented, they were unpredictable. If Alex was any indication of the human race's true potential, it wasn't just Earth that could pose a threat. The entire Dominion could be at risk. The commander's thoughts were interrupted as he saw Alex's figure flicker back on the simulation screen, the child now facing a new challenge. The game was still going. The stakes had been raised again. This time, the simulation placed Alex in an asteroid field, with only a few seconds to decide between fleeing or facing off against a formidable enemy. Vrox watched, leaning forward, holding his breath. Alex's fingers danced across the controls with a speed and precision that made the whole thing seem effortless. But there was more than that. The child's movements were deliberate. There was no hesitation, no fear. It was as if Alex was playing out a scenario not in a simulation, but in real life. This wasn't just about passing a test. It was about surviving, evolving. Vrox realized the truth. This wasn't simply a child's play or some fluke of technology. Alex had tapped into something far more advanced than the Shelter had ever anticipated, a level of intelligence, adaptability, and creativity that could challenge even the mightiest of empires. And the worst part was, humanity had only just begun to unlock their potential. Vrox couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't just a game. This was a glimpse into the future of a species that could reshape the galaxy. And he was watching it unfold. Vrox couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root in his chest. He had studied countless species, measured their strengths and weaknesses, but humanity was unlike anything he had encountered before. The more he watched Alex maneuver the starship in the simulation, the more Vrox realized that what he was witnessing was no ordinary display of talent. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. As Alex continued to push the limits of the simulation, Vrox ordered his officers to manipulate the parameters, to increase the complexity, to see how far the child could go. The simulation quickly adapted, presenting new and more lethal challenges: a swirling black hole, a supernova threatening to tear apart anything in its path, and a swarm of alien warships bent on destruction. Vrox expected the child to panic, to make mistakes, to falter under the pressure. But instead, Alex's focus sharpened, and the small human navigated the chaos with a calm that was nothing short of uncanny. The child's hands moved with purpose, eyes scanning the holographic interface with a precision that didn't seem human at all. Every calculated decision defied the odds, each move more daring and more creative than the last. Vrox was beginning to doubt that this was even a simulation anymore. The rules of the game seemed to bend and break at the will of the child, as if the entire system was struggling to keep up with Alex's rapid-fire thinking. Then, without warning, the simulation did something unexpected. It shifted. The once predictable environment, albeit dangerous, changed. A massive distortion opened in space before Alex, a sudden tear in the fabric of the simulated universe, and an entirely new set of parameters began to take form. The simulation had adapted in a way that Vrox hadn't commanded, as if it had started to learn from the child's every move, anticipating his next step. Vrox's heart rate quickened. This wasn't part of the design. The child had triggered something deeper in the system, something that neither he nor his fleet had accounted for. The simulation was no longer simply a training program. It was evolving in real time, adapting and shifting to the child's unpredictability. Vrox's mind raced. Was this some kind of error? Or had Alex done something to alter the very nature of the simulation? The starship now faced a new set of obstacles. Alien fighters more aggressive and intelligent than any program before, as well as rapidly decaying space-time zones that pulled at the very fabric of the universe. Yet Alex didn't flinch. The child responded with what could only be described as brilliance, weaving the starship through the anomalies, as though it were an extension of their own body. The simulation had gone beyond its original parameters, and the child, incredibly, was thriving. Vrox's officers were scrambling to regain control over the system, but every attempt to reset or interfere with the simulation was met with failure. Alex was in control now, not just of the starship, but of the very game itself. The shelter commander stood frozen in disbelief, realizing the full extent of what was happening. This human child had not only mastered the simulation, they had turned it against the system. Just as Vrox began to give orders to disconnect the simulation entirely, something even more profound happened. The starship Alex was piloting, once an inner tool in a training program, began to pulse with an unfamiliar energy. A hidden code, buried deep within the system, was unlocking. Alex wasn't merely playing the game anymore. The simulation had become something else. It was as if the child had tapped into the core of the system, bending it to their will. Vrox could no longer sit idly by. He had to know the truth. He ordered his fleet to analyze the simulation's core files, to trace the anomaly. But deep down, he already knew what this meant. Humanity had something he hadn't even considered before, an ability to not just adapt, but to reshape reality itself. And Alex was the first to show them all how it could be done. Vrox's mind raced as he observed the unfolding events. The simulation was no longer just a training tool. It had become a living entity, evolving with each moment, bending and shifting in ways the shelter had never anticipated. The child, Alex, was no longer simply participating in a game. The human had somehow taken control of the simulation itself, forcing it to adapt in ways that made no sense. What had once been a simple series of challenges had turned into a test of human ingenuity, and Vrox realized that this child was its mastermind. His officers were frantically attempting to regain control of the simulation, but their efforts were futile. Each time they made adjustments, the system adapted to counteract them. It was as if the simulation had developed a mind of its own, one that was learning from Alex's every move and evolving faster than the shelter could track. For the first time in his life, Vrox felt a deep unease. He had seen countless species fall to the might of the Dominion. And yet, here was a single child who was reshaping the entire premise of the game. Vrox turned to his second-in-command, a seasoned strategist named Ken, who stood with a grim look on his face. "We need to escalate the test," Vrox said, his voice tense. "If the child is manipulating the system, we need to test just how far this ability goes." Ken nodded and gave the command. The simulation's parameters were suddenly altered, pushing Alex and the starship to their absolute limits. Vrox wasn't just raising the stakes now. He was forcing a test of survival. The environment shifted drastically. The asteroid field vanished, replaced by a supermassive black hole at the center of the simulation's galaxy. Its gravitational pull distorted space itself, creating unstable rifts in the fabric of the virtual universe. In the distance, Vrox could see a massive fleet of hostile warships, fully armed and approaching fast. It was a do-or-die scenario. Alex's eyes flickered for just a moment, a flash of something like calculation, but the child didn't hesitate. Within seconds, the starship was plunging toward the black hole at full speed. The gravitational force was immense, pulling everything around it into its deadly grasp. But Alex piloted the ship with impossible precision. "Is the child insane?" Ken muttered, watching in awe. No one would willingly fly into that. But Vrox wasn't sure anymore. He had seen nothing in this simulation that had adhered to traditional logic. Alex wasn't flying into the black hole in a desperate attempt to escape. The child was using it. The ship's engines were fine-tuned to make a perfect trajectory, using the black hole's gravitational pull as an unexpected weapon. The simulation had never accounted for this. There was no programming in place for such an outlandish strategy. "She's creating a slingshot effect," Vrox murmured under his breath, watching the child's movements with growing fascination. The starship curved around the black hole, gaining speed at the exact right angle. It shot out of the other side, faster than the simulation could process, and suddenly, Alex was in a perfect position to strike. The hostile warships appeared from behind, unaware of the maneuver. Without warning, Alex launched a barrage of counterfire, striking one ship after another in a sequence so rapid and accurate that the alien fleet barely had time to react. The virtual enemy ships exploded in bursts of light, their debris scattered across the simulated space, leaving Alex untouched and unscathed. Vrox's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a child outsmarting a simple program anymore. This was a human who had mastered the art of thinking several steps ahead of anyone else in the simulation, manipulating the rules of the game with a strategy that left Vrox stunned. The black hole, the fleet of warships, the rifts in space. Alex had turned them into tools of victory. The shelter commander sat back, a realization dawning on him. He had underestimated humanity's potential. This was no longer just about technology, strength, or brute force. Humanity's true weapon was their ability to adapt, to think in ways that no one else could. And Alex had proven it. Vrox's voice was almost a whisper, as if speaking to himself. This is more than just survival. This is the power to reshape reality. The simulation had tested Alex's limits, and the child had passed with flying colors. But Vrox was left wondering, if one human could do this, what would happen when the rest of humanity realized their true potential? The Dominion might have underestimated Earth, but it would be a mistake they would soon regret. As Vrox continued to watch Alex navigate the simulation, something inside him shifted. The shelter had always prided themselves on their meticulous planning, their ability to predict and control. Their technology, their strategy, their superior intellect, it had all been the foundation of their empire. They had conquered countless worlds by calculating every possible outcome, ensuring they were always one step ahead. But what Alex was doing now, what the child had already done, was something that defied every law of prediction. Vrox had to admit it to himself. The humans weren't just survivors. They were innovators, bound by no limits. Each move Alex made was beyond the bounds of traditional warfare. There was no protocol that could account for this kind of thinking, no algorithm designed to anticipate such rapid, creative adaptations. The child was shaping the simulation in real time, bending the fabric of its rules to fit a vision of battle that had never been considered. Vrox felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting. What did this mean for the shelter? What did this mean for the galaxy? Vrox ordered his officers to examine the simulation's core files once again, hoping to understand how such a thing was possible. They worked quickly, tracing the deep data streams, pulling up every line of code, trying to determine whether Alex's manipulation was an anomaly, a fluke, or something much more profound. They found no error in the system, no flaw. The child wasn't simply exploiting weaknesses in the simulation's design. Alex was rewriting it from within. The commander's thoughts grew darker. Alex was more than just a tactical genius. The human child had an ability to change the rules of the game itself. What would happen when the rest of humanity tapped into this potential? Could they replicate it? Could they find ways to exploit this ability on a grander scale? The more Vrox watched, the more he realized that the entire human race might be unknowingly sitting on a well of untapped genius, capable of reshaping entire worlds. Humanity's true strength wasn't in their weapons or their technology. It was in their minds, their ability to think and act in ways that no other species had ever considered. And Alex, this single child, was the proof. Vrox's unease began to turn into something deeper: respect. He had never thought of humans as anything more than primitive, emotional creatures, easily manipulated or destroyed. But now he saw them in a new light. He had witnessed humanity's potential for the first time, and it was nothing short of terrifying. In all his years of command, he had never encountered a species so unpredictable, so capable of shaping reality through sheer willpower and creativity. It was no longer just a question of whether humans could challenge the shelter. It was a question of how quickly they could adapt to defeat them. Alex's face flashed on the screen again, eyes fixed on the virtual controls. The starship was now deep in enemy territory, surrounded by an armada of warships, a scenario that would have had any other commander fleeing for their lives. But Alex wasn't fleeing. The child's hands moved with complete assurance, almost as if the entire universe had become a puzzle to be solved. Vrox's officers began to murmur in awe as they watched the simulation unfold. Alex didn't rely on brute force. The child wasn't trying to overpower the enemy. Alex was playing a game of patience, of cunning. The human was moving pieces around, drawing the enemy in, setting traps that had yet to be revealed. The starship was dancing through the battlefield, drawing the alien warships closer, then slipping away at the last second, only to return with devastating precision. Vrox realized that Alex was manipulating not just the simulation, but the very nature of warfare itself. Alex wasn't confined to the rules of space or time, to the limits of technology. Instead, the child had unlocked a way of thinking that allowed them to use anything and everything as a weapon, even the very environment itself. It was as if Alex could read the battlefield and see the future, predicting every move, every counterattack, every decision the enemy would make. It was brilliant, and it was terrifying. If this was the true nature of humanity, then the galaxy would never be the same. No matter how advanced the shelter were, no matter how strong their fleets or how superior their technology, there was no predicting or controlling something like this. Vrox finally allowed himself to accept the truth. Humanity was no longer a species to be underestimated. Alex was a glimpse into what the future of the human race could be: innovative, unpredictable, and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And if the child's mind was a representation of humanity's potential, then the shelter were in grave danger. The more Vrox watched, the more his mind whirred with a quiet, ominous realization. Humanity, in its most basic form, was unpredictable, chaotic even. But that chaos, that raw ability to adapt and evolve, was something beyond anything his species had faced. It wasn't just that the human child was playing the simulation like a master. Alex was proving that humans could outthink and outmaneuver even the most advanced strategies the shelter had ever devised. This was a turning point, and Vrox could sense it. With each passing moment, as the simulation continued to play out, the truth began to settle deep in Vrox's bones. Humanity had the potential to become a force that could not be contained or controlled. If Alex's brilliance was representative of humanity as a whole, it wouldn't be long before the rest of the galaxy learned this painful lesson. Vrox glanced at the data streaming in from his officers. The child had been in the simulation for hours now, facing down wave after wave of increasingly complex enemies. And each time, Alex adapted, found a way through the chaos, and emerged victorious. The systems were no longer responding to the usual commands. Every attempt to increase the difficulty, to throw new challenges at Alex, was met with a new, unexpected response. It was as though the child was in constant communication with the very heart of the simulation, every move calculated to anticipate and exploit what came next. But what really struck Vrox was the growing realization that Alex wasn't just manipulating the game. The child was learning in real time, processing each new scenario like a sponge absorbing information, and using that knowledge to adjust to future threats. In one of the most recent sequences, Alex had encountered a massive, sentient alien fleet, a race of beings so powerful, their technology could warp space itself. In response, Alex had stopped thinking of the simulation as just a series of battles. Instead, the child had transformed the battlefield, using the environment to set traps, using debris from destroyed ships to create distractions, and even distorting the virtual simulation's gravity fields to disorient the enemy. The fleet of sentient aliens, which would have decimated any other combatant, found themselves caught in a series of impossible one-sided moves, and Alex had emerged victorious once again. But it wasn't just the result of the simulation that stunned Vrox. It was the method. The child hadn't just reacted. Alex had turned the tables on the very framework of the simulation, questioning its boundaries and pushing beyond them. It was like the child had found a way to manipulate the core of the game itself. For a brief moment, Vrox felt a pang of unease ripple through him. He had spent a lifetime perfecting his people's strategies, bending the laws of warfare and conquest to their will. But this was something he couldn't quantify. This wasn't just about numbers or firepower. This was about creativity, adaptability, and the ability to see beyond the limits of known technology. The Shelter were used to being the ones who controlled the flow of battles, who dictated the outcome. But here, in front of him, was proof that a single human mind could rewrite the future of warfare. "Commander," one of his officers spoke, breaking Vrox from his thoughts. "We've traced the core anomaly. It's not a flaw in the simulation. It's a deliberate shift. This child is manipulating it in ways we've never seen before. There's no way to stop it." The officer's words landed like a blow. No way to stop it. Vrox's mind reeled as he processed the implications. The simulation had already begun to learn from Alex, and soon it would adapt faster than any attempt to shut it down. But even worse, this wasn't just about one child's capabilities. It was about the potential of every human mind. If Alex could unlock this kind of ability, could others? Could entire armies of these human children become weapons far beyond what the Shelter had ever faced? "Prepare a direct link to the simulation," Vrox ordered, his voice cold and calm. "I want to speak with the child." His officers looked at each other in confusion, but they complied. The holocommunication interface flickered to life, and there, standing in front of him in the shimmering blue light, was Alex, no longer just a faceless participant in a game. The child's eyes met his through the transmission, as calm as ever, but there was something else there now. A knowing glint. Vrox took a deep breath, his voice steady as he addressed the human. "You've proven yourself, child. But I need to know, how much further can you push this? How much more can you manipulate?" Alex's response came not with words, but with a subtle smile, as if to say that the real game had just begun. Vrox's blood ran cold. The child had already answered the question. They could push further, much further. And humanity was just beginning to realize the true power they wielded. Vrox watched as Alex's expression shifted subtly, the calmness of the child's face hiding a deeper understanding that sent a shiver down the Shelter commander's spine. The child had not spoken a word, but the message was clear. Alex knew the game had changed. Vrox's mind raced, but his resolve hardened. He had spent years navigating the complex web of galactic politics and warfare, always in control, always calculating. Now, for the first time in his career, he found himself facing something he could not predict, something that could no longer be controlled. The game had moved beyond the confines of military strategy. It was now a battle of ideologies, of new ways of thinking. The human child before him had, in the span of hours, shattered everything Vrox had once believed about the limitations of any species, about what warfare and power truly meant. The silence stretched between them as the hololink flickered. Then Alex spoke, their voice soft, but laced with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of Vrox's neck rise. "This isn't about me anymore," the child said, eyes unwavering. "You're looking at the future, humanity's future, and we're not going to just follow the path set before us. We're going to carve our own." Vrox's heart skipped a beat. The words, though simple, were laced with a quiet certainty that felt like a declaration. Alex wasn't just talking about one child's capability. Alex was speaking for humanity as a whole, for all the minds the human race could potentially cultivate, all the untapped potential lying dormant in their species. This was more than a threat. It was a promise. Vrox's mind flipped back to the patterns of the simulation. What Alex had done was no accident. The child had manipulated the program, learned from it, bent it to their will, and then let it evolve. Humanity had unlocked something far beyond technology or brute force, something that wasn't bound by the limitations of conventional warfare. It was a force of pure creativity and adaptation. It was evolution at its most dangerous. And the more Vrox thought about it, the clearer it became. This was the start of something irreversible. The Shelter had never encountered a force like this. Every battle they'd fought had been a measured calculation, every conflict a result of their superior intellect and planning. But now, with humanity and Alex leading the charge, that system was crumbling. Alex wasn't just reshaping simulations. Alex was proving that humans could take control of their own evolution, rewriting the laws of possibility as easily as one might draw a new path on a map. Vrox's grip on the armrest tightened. "I see now," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "You humans have always been resourceful, but this is different. You're not just adapting to your environment. You're changing it. You've shown me that." Alex nodded, the faintest hint of a smile pulling at the corners of their mouth. "We're not just here to survive, Commander. We're here to lead. We're here to make our mark on the galaxy. And we're going to do it on our terms, not yours, not anyone's." The finality in Alex's tone was undeniable. Vrox could feel the weight of those words press against his chest. He realized then that this was not merely the emergence of a new power. It was the beginning of a paradigm shift. Humanity wasn't going to settle for the status quo. They weren't going to be a pawn in the Dominion's game or anyone else's. They were going to rewrite the rules, and every being in the galaxy would have to contend with that fact. For a long moment, Vrox simply stared at the child, his mind processing everything he had just witnessed. The realization came slowly but inevitably. The Dominion was at the dawn of a new era, one where humanity would rise not just as survivors, but as innovators, as disruptors of everything the Shelter had come to know. The balance of power had just shifted, and there was nothing Vrox could do to stop it. Alex's smile deepened, their eyes narrowing with a knowing glint. "I hope you're ready for what comes next, Commander." Vrox didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long, steadying breath, his mind processing the implications. For the first time in his life, he understood what true fear felt like. Fear not of weapons or armies, but of the boundless potential of the human mind. And the worst part was, this was only the beginning.